I'm sorry for this. Or originally, I was asked, "Can you do a talk too?" And I said, "No, I don't have any subject I want to really talk about." Um, but then I had a subject, and I wanted to first hijack Craig's talk, but he said, "No, I want to use the 45 minutes." So then he said, I told him about this, and he said, I said, maybe I'll just do an open space, and he said, no, I think you should just hijack the Q&A. So that's what we decided to do. Um,
Don't applause. Don't applause. Don't.
it makes the moderator slightly uncomfortable. But
Story of my life.
It's only going to be very short. It's just I decided I want to share some thoughts that I've had that just happened to come up the last months. And I'll probably make an open space session if there's slots available tomorrow, if you're interested in talking more. And then it will take about 10, 15 minutes or so. And then we'll have the Q&A. And it's called Large Scale Agile Health Metrics. So usually we don't actually, if you look at our writing, we rarely talk about specific metrics. But because most of the time we're more interested in the organizational dynamics around metrics and how they're used in organizations, because that's most of the time the problem and not the metrics itself. But it happened that recently I ended up via many different streams, ended up creating a set of metrics, and I thought, let me share them with you. The metrics that I'll share have four purposes. The first one, they're tied to a certain dynamic in less, and they're kind of like quick ways of seeing whether a certain thing is working or not working. And second, closely related, they trigger discussions. At least we hope they trigger discussions on like, why would you want to measure that thing, and why would you want it to be lower or higher or something like that. Then one of the things that we have is that often in less adoption, somebody in an organization says you need to give some metrics, and most of the time the metrics that they provide are not really the ones that you want to measure. And one of the ways to cope with that is give them a bunch of other metrics back and say, sure, we can measure something, but we'll use these metrics. And then even more fun, and that's one of the things going on now also, is when you have an organization with multiple different kind of agile adoptions, you can also suggest, and I would suggest this, suggest to your management to use these metrics to also measure the non-less adoptions, because they look very interesting from these metrics perspective. So they're not made for targets and standards and things like that. So very quickly, the first metric is the amount of backlog that exists longer than exactly one sprint. And obviously, unless you would want it to be one. I suggest everyone in some kind of agile adoption to think about your adoption at the same time and figure what it is for you. I do want to stress the longer than exactly one sprint, because this also means that one of the things I've often seen is that teams start creating sprint backlogs in refinement rather than in planning. And that would, of course, mean that it exists longer than one sprint, and therefore that wouldn't make sense either. The percentage of backlog items, the percentage of items in the product backlog that an end customer can understand without additional explanation. So just give your product backlog to a customer and say, which one can you understand? Let them think it, and if it's high, then your product backlog is good. If it's no, then probably you have a task list or component teams or things like that. You'll discover that very quickly. In the bottom, I sometimes put another slide related to the topic that this relates to. The commits per developer per day. If you want to do more commits as a developer, then you will need to learn to break down your work in more incremental ways, and therefore simply measuring the amount of commits per developer per day, it gives you some indication. If it is 1 commit per 4 days or so, you should be worried. And the percentage of commits directly to trunk, so no pull requests or branches or any of that, just how many of your commits are going directly to trunk without branches or pull requests. If it's 0%, then in my opinion, you should be worried.
And not every team has their own trunk.
This is something that we sometimes call the Terry's Agility Index, percentage of items selected in a sprint that didn't exist before the previous sprint review. For a lot of adoptions that I work on, this is 0 because they still have a fixed scope and they pretend to do agile development, but they don't actually use the feedback because of their fixed scope, and it becomes very visible for that. Obviously, 100% all the time is a bit weird, and setting targets for it is even weirder.
And Craig's addition to this is also the percentage of items in PBR that didn't exist at the last sprint review.
The amount of items that are shared but not done at the end of a sprint. Also sometimes called spillover or carryover work. It doesn't mean that you cannot throw items out, but you shouldn't start an item and then leave it half done at the end of a sprint. Whenever that happens, probably your team is not cross-learning and you're secretly creating buffers to protect yourself from that. The amount of ancestors in progress per sprint. So usually in the top of the backlog, you have small items, but the small items tend to originate from larger items, which in Less we sometimes refer to ancestors. And measuring the amount of those larger items that the smaller items originate from is probably a good idea. But it shouldn't be very small or very big, but if you measure it, it should not equal to your team size. And for the amount of teams, not the team size. So not equal to the amount of teams. So if you have 5 teams and this is 5, something is probably wrong.
And a jargon variation of this is epics in progress per sprint. That would again suggest big batch work.
The amount of days per week with all teams in the office. I want to stress the word all teams at the same time, not letting teams decide themselves whenever they want to come, because that creates a lot of interesting other dysfunctions again. And then last one, the definition of done, but I'm not going to explain that further for now, except that in Less we consider that a metric and an important one. And that's it. Is that 15 minutes? Not
No,
yet, right?
you have time. You have to go on.
Yeah,
5 minutes.
That's it. If you have any questions about this, there will be an open space session maybe for that tomorrow. And I hope you track them and measure them. And if they decide to be useful then at some point we'll write some more about it. And maybe this will be the only time you'll ever hear about that, but we'll see.
Thank you very much.
That's it. Thank you.
Perfect.